There is a saying among the navigators of the Immaterium of man, those blessed and cursed souls who peer into the roiling madness of the Immaterium with their third eye open and their sanity held together by nothing more than breeding and prayer. The saying goes like this: nothing enters the eye of terror willingly. Worlds had been swallowed by it. Entire fleet expeditions had been consumed, their screaming crews scattered across demon worlds where time moved like syrup and sanity was the first casualty of arrival. The eye was not a place. It was a wound in reality, 10,000 years old, carved open by the fall of the Eldar, maintained by the endless hunger of four gods who had never agreed on anything except that mortals existed to be unmade. Nothing entered the eye of terror willingly. The Doomslayer entered it at a dead sprint. There was no ship, no navigator, no Geller field humming between him and the howling non-space of the warp. One moment he had been descending through a dimensional bleed point, a hell portal torn open between realities by demonic architects who had made the fatal error of believing their dimension was the only one worth fearing. And the next, the geometry of existence had simply hiccuped. The bleed point had intersected with something vast and hungry and incomprehensibly old. A chaos ritual performed on the far side of the veil, 10,000 light years from anything that could be called civilization, had sent tremors through the barrier between the warp and real space. And the Doomslayer, mid-descent, mid-hunt, had been swallowed. He hit demon world soil at terminal velocity and left a crater. The world was called Piraculum by the few mortal scholars who had documented it from a safe distance, which is to say, from the other side of the galaxy, working from intercepted transmissions and the fever dreams of captured chaos cultists. It was 1,000 suns demon world, saturated with the crystalline blue and gold architecture of Tzeentchian sorcery. Towers of solidified word flame rose from a landscape of fractured obsidian and mutated stone. The sky was not a sky. It was a ceiling of writhing sigils, each one the size of a city, shifting and rearranging themselves in patterns that rewrote local probability with every cycle. The air tasted of copper and old parchment and the specific flavor of reality being politely but firmly ignored. The crater smoked. For 3 seconds, an eternity, in a place where demons measured their attention spans in civilizations, nothing moved. The rubric Marines stationed at the nearest crystalline spire turned their eyeless helmets toward the impact point with the slow, eerie synchronicity of automata receiving a new instruction. The dust was still rising. The obsidian was still cracking, fractures spreading outward from the point at impact in patterns that, to a sufficiently learned sorcerer, spelled out a single word in 17 dead languages simultaneously. Predator. The Doomslayer stood up. The Praetor Suit was running a damage assessment. Minor argent energy bleed in the lateral weapon couplings. The BFG's charge cycle was flagging unstable, and the plasma rifle's energy feed was cycling at 73% efficiency. His heads-up display flickered with interference, weird flame frequencies washing across his visor in waves of Tzeentchian blue before his suit's countermeasures suppressed them. The Crucible, magnetically sealed at his back, pulsed once with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He looked around. He saw demons. His hands moved before conscious thought completed the journey from observation to decision, which was, after all, the only way the Doomslayer had ever operated. The super shotgun was in his hands, and the first rubric marine dissolved in a cascade of bolt and shot before the crystalline dust from his landing had finished settling. The second and third followed in the same breath. The fourth raised a staff, crackling with wired fire, and the Doomslayer was already inside its guard, the glory kill sequence triggering with brutal efficiency. Gauntleted fingers through ceramic and ancient binding script, a soul vessel shattered, the automaton collapsing into loose armor and sighing dust. The wired flame tried to climb his gauntlet. It found nothing to hold on to. There's a specific quality to the warp's corruption, a searching, probing hunger that looks for cracks in a soul, the way water looks for cracks in stone. Pride, rage, despair, desire. Every mortal mind has them. Every mortal mind, when exposed to the raw Immaterium, bleeds something into the psychic ether that the entities there can taste and follow and widen. The Doomslayer's soul, by every measurable metric, should have been a feast. He carried rage enough to fuel a crusade. He had suffered loss that would have shattered lesser beings across every dimension he had ever crossed. The word flame found no cracks, not because the rage wasn't there, but because the rage was the wall. He was already moving toward the next spire, weapons reloading with mechanical precision, and behind him, the crater was already being reinterpreted by the shifting sigils in the sky. The patterns changed. The probability rewrites stuttered. And in the upper atmosphere of Paraculum, in the space between one impossible architectural configuration and the next, something watching through 1,000 scrying lenses went very, very still. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions and impossible predators unleashed into the darkest corners of the galaxy, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the dark millennium. The Doomslayer had been in the eye of terror for approximately 90 seconds. He had already killed 11 things. He showed no signs of stopping. Paraculum had stood for 6,000 years. It had been raised from raw demon world stone by the will of Magnus, the Red's most devoted disciples in the centuries following the Horus heresy. When the 1,000 Suns had retreated into the Eye of Terror to lick wounds that would never fully close, the world was a monument to sorcerous achievement. Every tower, a repository of stolen knowledge, every sigil-covered avenue, a working equation in the mathematics of fate manipulation. The rubric marines who patrolled its crystalline streets were not guards in any conventional sense. They were warnings, demonstrations of what the 1,000 Suns were capable of. Any force foolish enough to assault Paraculum would face not merely an army, but a world that actively rewrote the laws of probability against them. Misfire rates climbing, armor ceramite developing microfractures along precisely calculated stress points, coordinated attacks dissolving into confusion as the sigil ceiling shuffled tactical intentions like cards in an infinite deck. The Doomslayer did not have tactical intentions. He had direction. And there's a fundamental flaw in probability manipulation as a defensive strategy, and it is this. Probability only governs outcomes that have multiple possible results. A lasgun shot might hit or miss. Probability can work with that. A coordinated flanking maneuver might succeed or fail. Probability can work with that too. But a being that moves in only one direction, toward the enemy, at maximum speed, with absolute commitment to a single outcome, gives probability very little to manipulate. You cannot calculate misfire rates for a weapon whose wielder will close the distance and use it as a club if it runs dry. You cannot engineer armor fractures in a suit that simply absorbs the damage and keeps moving. By the time the Thousand Sons garrison mustered a coordinated response, the Doomslayer had cleared 4 city blocks of Paraculum's outer district. The architecture itself attempted to intervene. Tzeentchian sorcery ran through the buildings like a nervous system, and as the garrison's surviving sorcerers pushed power into the world's defensive lattice, the streets began to rearrange. Towers rotated. Avenues folded back on themselves. Stairways that led upward deposited travelers facing the ground. It was the kind of spatial manipulation that had driven Imperial assault forces into screaming, dissociated madness before they could fire a single shot. Reality becoming a puzzle with no solution, identity bleeding away as up and down lost their meaning. The Doomslayer walked through a wall. Not metaphorically. The Praetor Suit registered the structural composition of the crystalline barrier. Weird flame-infused obsidian, roughly 60 centimeters thick. And the Doomslayer's assessment of the obstacle lasted approximately 1/3 of a second before he put his shoulder through it at a dead run. The wall shattered. The spatial manipulation on the other side attempted to redirect him upward. He landed on the ceiling. He oriented himself with the casual indifference of a man who had navigated hell dimensions where gravity was more of a suggestion than a rule, and continued moving. The sorcerers watching through scrying lenses began to confer with increasing urgency. Their subject was not behaving according to any recorded pattern. The Thousand Sons had faced space marines, Eldar aspect warriors, demon princes, even rival chaos warbands with champions blessed by competing gods. Every category of threat had predictable responses to spatial disorientation. Even the most disciplined space marine could be slowed by reality inversion. Even the most seasoned demon prince needed a moment to reorient when the laws of physics reshuffled themselves. The thing in the Praetor Suit paused for exactly long enough to locate the next concentration of enemies on his motion tracker, then moved toward them with renewed purpose. "It doesn't disorient," one sorcerer reported, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man trying to sound calm, while his instruments told him something categorically impossible. Spatial inversion has zero effect on its movement patterns. It's using the disorientation as terrain. "Run the soul scan again," his superior instructed. The soul scan ran. The results came back the same as the first 3 attempts. The being in the Praetor Suit had a soul, a vast, ancient, burning thing, like a star that had collapsed and then refused to go cold, but it was sealed. Not by any sorceress ward they recognized, not by a null field or a pariah's anti-psychic presence. It was sealed by something internal, something that had been compressed by weight and time and loss into a density that the warp's probing fingers simply could not penetrate. It was like trying to corrupt a black hole. The hunger was there, but it had already consumed everything in reach and turned inward, and there was nothing left for chaos to grab onto. "What is it?" a junior sorcerer asked. Before his superior could answer, the wall of their tower came down. The Doomslayer stepped through the gap, super shotgun tracking left to right across the chamber with the methodical efficiency of a being who had cleared 10,000 rooms in 10,000 dimensions and had never once needed to be told what came next. The junior sorcerer raised a hand, crackling with weird flame. The glory kill that followed was not something that could be described in language that retained any dignity. What could be said was that it was fast, and that it was final, and that the word flame died with its caster. The superior sorcerer, older, more disciplined, wrapped in enough binding script to make himself a walking archive of the Thousand Sons' collective knowledge, did not raise his staff. He raised one hand, palm outward, in a gesture of pause. The Doomslayer's shotgun leveled at his helmet. "You are not a demon," the sorcerer said. His voice carried the layered resonance of a mind that had lived for millennia and spent most of that time in direct contact with the warp's information currents. "You are not chaos. You are not of this universe." A pause. "And you are making an extraordinary amount of noise." The shotgun did not lower. "There is a being," the sorcerer continued, with the careful diction of someone who understood that the next 5 seconds were the most important of his very long life, "who will want to know you exist. And unlike everyone else in this realm, he will not send warriors to destroy you." Another pause. "He will come himself." The Doomslayer's visor read no psychic deception in the sorcerer's posture, no tension that suggested a trap being sprung, in only the very specific physiological signature, even through ceramite and binding script, of something that was genuinely, intellectually fascinated. He didn't lower the shotgun, but he didn't pull the trigger. The sorcerer's name was Uthorix the Chronicler, and he had survived 6,000 years in the Eye of Terror by being, above all other things, useful. Not powerful, though he was that. Not loyal, though he performed loyalty with sufficient conviction to satisfy those who required it. Useful. He had survived the purges of rivals, the attention of demons, the occasional displeasure of Magnus himself, by ensuring that at every critical juncture, he was the one holding information that no one else had yet thought to acquire. Information was the only currency in the Eye of Terror that couldn't be stolen by a blade in the back or a weird flame bolt through the chest. Knowledge lived in the mind, and Uthorix had spent 6 millennia making his mind very difficult to kill. He was looking at the most valuable piece of information he had ever encountered. The being hadn't killed him. That alone was remarkable. In Uthorix's experience, things that moved the way this creature moved and hit the way this creature hit did not typically pause for conversation. But here it stood, filling the doorway of his scrying chamber with its armored bulk, the double-barreled weapon still trained on his helmet with the patient certainty of a thing that would pull the trigger the moment it detected a reason to. The suit it wore was extraordinary, Not Astartes manufacture, not Mechanicus, not Xenos in any pattern he recognized. It was older than any of those traditions. The metal remembered violence the way a blade remembers every edge it has ever sharpened against. Uthoryx kept his hands visible and his thoughts carefully organized. "You came through a dimensional intersection," he said, not a question. The ritual being performed on the outer edge of the eye, a Slaaneshi working, poorly constructed, as their rituals invariably are, created a bleed point between the Immaterium and an adjacent hell dimension. You were inside that dimension when the intersection occurred." The visor stared at him with absolute, unreadable focus. "You want to go back," Uthoryx continued. "That is the most logical inference. You are not here by choice. You are here because the geometry of reality hiccuped and swallowed you. And now you are in an environment that is actively hostile to everything you are." He tilted his helmet slightly, as close to a contemplative gesture as a being wrapped in centuries of binding script could manage. "The question is whether you understand that destroying everything in sight will not open a door back to your dimension. It will simply make you the most dangerous corpse in the eye of terror." A long silence. The shotgun didn't move, but the trigger wasn't pulled. Uthoryx took that as an invitation to continue. "The dimensional intersection that brought you here left a resonance signature, a scar in the local warp fabric that, with sufficient sorceress expertise and the right ritual components, could theoretically be reopened, widened, used." He let that sit for a moment. "I have the expertise. I lack certain components that would require travel deeper into the eye." A pause. Travel that would be considerably safer, with something capable of walking through walls and killing rubric marines with its bare hands. The scrying lenses around the room reflected the Doomslayer back at himself from 17 angles. Uthoryx watched those reflections carefully, looking for any tell in the armored posture, any micro-movement that would indicate the creature was weighing the offer against the simpler option of simply killing him and continuing its rampage. He had presented the logic cleanly. The creature was clearly intelligent. Its movements were tactical, not frenzied. It had paused for conversation when a lesser predator would have simply continued killing. It understood, on some level, that raw violence had limits. The gauntleted hand reached out and closed around the barrel of the scrying lens closest to the door. It crushed the lens into powder without apparent effort. Then it stepped back from the doorway. It angled its body in the direction Uthoryx had been gesturing when he said deeper into the eye, and waited. Uthoryx released a breath he had been holding for approximately 4 minutes. "Excellent," he said. "Try not to destroy anything load-bearing on the way out." They moved through Paraculum's outer districts in a silence that was, on one side, the professional quiet of a sorcerer who had learned that conversation during transit was a good way to miss the sound of an ambush, and on the other side, the absolute silence of a being that appeared to have no interest in conversation under any circumstances. The Doomslayer moved through the crystalline streets with a situational awareness that Uthoryx found genuinely unsettling. Not the wide-eyed vigilance of a soldier who had been told to expect danger, but the settled, bone-deep awareness of a predator who had long ago stopped being surprised by threats and simply cataloged them as they appeared. 3 times on the route to Paraculum's transit spire, rubric marine patrols intersected their path. The first time, Uthorix raised a hand, and the patrol's path was sorcerously redirected, a simple enough trick on a world whose architecture responded to his will. The second time, the patrol had already seen them, and Uthorix began composing the opening lines of an explanation that would require considerable political delicacy to deliver to warriors who had just watched their garrison be dismantled by a single armored figure. The Doomslayer was already through them before Uthorix finished the first sentence. The third time, Uthorix didn't bother. At the transit spire, a towering needle of blue-gold crystal that served as Paraculum's primary void translation point, in allowing travel between demon worlds within the eye. Uthorix paused at the activation dais and looked back at his unlikely companion. The Praetor Suit's visor caught the weird flame light of the spire's power conduits and threw it back as a flat, unreflective green. "Where we are going," Uthorix said carefully, "is called the Screaming Vortex, a sub-region of the eye where the warp fabric is thin enough that dimensional signatures bleed through from adjacent realities." He began inputting the transit coordinates. It is also where 3 separate Chaos warbands have established competing territorial claims, where the planet Sacrave floats at the center of a permanent demon storm, and where the last known location of the ritual components I require happens to be. He looked at the Doomslayer directly. "I mention this not because I expect it to concern you, but because I want to be clear that I am aware of what I am asking you to walk into." The transit field began to hum, crystalline light folding reality into a doorway. The Doomslayer stepped through it first. Uthorix followed, making a mental note that 6,000 years of survival instinct was apparently no match for whatever this creature ran on, and wondering, not for the first time since the crater had appeared in his outer district, what exactly it was that the warp had accidentally imported into its own territory. The transit field closed behind them. On Paraculum, the sigil ceiling went still for the first time in centuries. Every shifting pattern, every probability rewrite, every fate calculation frozen in place. They all pointed the same direction, deeper. The Screaming Vortex earned its name. It was not a metaphor, or if it had begun as one, the warp had long since made it literal. The region existed at the intersection of 4 competing demonic territories: Kornate, Tzientchian, Slaaneshi, and Nurglite, and the psychic pressure of 4 divine wills grinding against each other had turned the local warp fabric into something resembling a wound that had been repeatedly reopened before it could scar. The void between demon worlds crackled with competing energies. Ships that entered without proper warding found their crews developing contradictory mutations. Kornati rage warring with Slaaneshi dissociation. Nurglite resignation eating through Tzientchian ambition, until the passengers were no longer coherent enough to navigate, and the ships drifted into the storm to be claimed by whichever god's current was strongest that cycle. The transit spire deposited them on Sacrave. Sacrave was a world that had given up on having a surface in any conventional sense. The planet's crust had been shattered by 10 millennia of competing demonic incursions, leaving a landscape of floating continental fragments suspended above a core of exposed molten stone that burned with the particular orange red of genuine geological process rather than demonic theater. The fragments drifted on thermal currents and warp eddies, occasionally colliding with the grinding, a continent-sized impact of tectonic plates that had forgotten their proper relationship with gravity. Between the fragments, in the superheated thermals rising from the exposed core, demon flocks wheeled and dove, creatures of pure warp stuff given temporary physical form by the region's psychic pressure, burning themselves out like mayflies in the material resonance of Sacrave's dying geology. Euthorix landed on a continental fragment roughly the size of a hive city's footprint, and immediately began consulting his instruments. The Doomslayer landed beside him and immediately began consulting his motion tracker. There were, according to the tracker's reading, approximately 400 life signs on this fragment alone. The signatures were wrong in ways that the tracker flagged with yellow uncertainty markers. Too large, too energetic, like their movement patterns describing the specific erratic geometry of things that did not have nervous systems organized along conventional biological lines. Demons. The tracker had never been designed to read demons. It was doing its best. The Doomslayer had been dealing with things his equipment wasn't designed to read for a very long time. The first wave hit them from the eastern edge of the fragment. Bloodletters, Khorne's foot soldiers, hellblades drawn, and the ground trembling under their hooves with each stride. They came in a column 40 wide and 10 deep, and they came fast with the specific joyful ferocity of beings who had just detected something that their every instinct told them was worth killing. The brass of their armor caught the light of the exposed core below and threw it back in sheets of orange red that made them look, from a distance, like an avalanche made of fire. Euthorix stepped backward. The Doomslayer stepped forward. What followed was not a battle in any sense that military historians would recognize. A battle implied two forces in conflict, each adapting to the other, each seeking advantage through positioning and coordination and the management of resources. What the Doomslayer conducted on the eastern edge of that continental fragment was something older and more absolute than battle. It was a demonstration. The super shotgun opened the engagement at range, a meat-shot groupings that sent bloodletters sprawling in sprays of ichor, the meat hook of his equipment system pulling him into the gaps in their line before they could close ranks. The chainsaw, that most primal of his weapons, the one that spoke in the language that demons understood better than any other, which was the language of being physically unmade, handled the press when they bunched up. Glory kills cascaded through the column like a current. Each execution fed the Praetor Suit's energy reserves with a pulse of something that felt, to the suit systems, like argent energy, but carried a different flavor, the specific metaphysical residue of demonic essence being violently returned to the warp before it was ready. The suit flagged it as an unknown energy type and filed it for analysis. The Doomslayer filed it as useful and kept moving. 43 seconds after the first wave made contact, the eastern edge of the fragment was quiet. From somewhere above them, from the thermal columns between the floating continents, from the daemon flocks that had been wheeling in their distant patterns, a sound rose. It started low, below the threshold of hearing, felt in the chest and the back teeth rather than processed through the ears. It built. It became, over the course of approximately 10 seconds, the loudest sound either of them had heard on Sackgrave, which was significant given that the planet was named after the noise it made. It was not screaming, it was cheering. Uthorix looked up. The demon flocks had changed their patterns. They were no longer wheeling in the lazy thermals of scavengers waiting for carrion. They were circling the fragment in tight, excited rotations, the way iron filings reorganize themselves around a newly introduced magnet. Their attention, the raw, a directional pressure of warp stuff oriented toward a single point, was focused entirely on the figure standing in the ichor-soaked wreckage of 40 bloodletters. That, Uthorix said, with the careful neutrality of a man trying very hard not to show that he was alarmed, is going to be a problem. The Doomslayer looked at him. Khorne, Uthorix said, the blood god. He doesn't care from whom blood flows, only that it does. You have just killed 40 of his servants in less than a minute in the middle of his territorial claim. He paused. In the theology of Khorne, that doesn't make you an enemy. Another pause. It makes you a champion. The motion tracker updated. The new contacts were not coming from the eastern edge of the fragment. They were coming from everywhere simultaneously, descending from the thermal columns, rising from the fragment's edges, materializing from the warp bleed directly with the specific psychic pressure of entities large enough that the tracker displayed them not as individual contacts, but as events. Greater demons, bloodthirsters, the apex predators of Khorne's hierarchy, each one a being of such concentrated divine violence that the air around them ionized visibly, crackling with the specific ozone and iron smell of divine murder made manifest. They were not attacking, they were presenting themselves. The largest bloodthirster, a creature 30 meters tall, its brass armor fused directly to the demonic flesh beneath, its twin axes, each the size of a Lehman Russ battle tank, descended from the thermal column directly above the fragment and landed with an impact that cracked the continental stone in a radius of 50 meters. It looked down at the Doomslayer with eyes like furnace openings, and in its gaze was something that no mortal had ever survived long enough to correctly identify. Recognition. It spoke in a voice like tectonic plates exchanging opinions. Skulls. The Doomslayer looked up at it. Then he looked at Uthorix. Uthorix had the expression of a man rapidly revising every assumption he had made about how this expedition would proceed. It's offering you a place, he said, in Khorne's hierarchy, as a champion. His voice had taken on a very specific quality. The quality of someone who had just realized that the situation had developed considerably beyond any scenario he had prepared contingencies for. Khorne has noticed the skull count. He approves. The bloodthirster raised one of its axes, not in threat, but in the specific gesture of formal acknowledgement that coronate hierarchy used to recognize a warrior of sufficient violence as worthy of direct divine attention. The Doomslayer reached up. For one moment, Uthorix genuinely believed the creature was going to take the offered axe salute, and the theological implications of that began cascading through his 6,000-year-old mind at a speed that left him slightly dizzy. The Doomslayer pointed at the Bloodthirster. Then he pointed at the ground in front of him. The universal language of "you're next." The screaming vortex lived up to its name. The Bloodthirster's name, in the brass and marrow language of Khorne's hierarchy, translated roughly as "he who drowns worlds in red." It had held that name for 9,000 years. It had earned it across 47 campaigns, 11 planetary extinctions, and one occasion where it had personally strangled a Chaos Titan with its own power cables. It was, by every metric available to beings capable of measuring such things, one of the most dangerous entities in the Eye of Terror. It hit the ground in 11 seconds. Not dead. Demons of that magnitude couldn't be permanently destroyed in real space without weapons specifically consecrated to the purpose, and the Doomslayer's arsenal, formidable as it was, had not been blessed by the Emperor's light or forged in the fires of the Immaterium's divine opposition to chaos. But down. Comprehensively, humiliatingly, structurally down. One wing shattered, in both axes lost to glory kill executions that had torn them from its grip with the specific mechanical brutality of a being who understood that a weapon in an enemy's hand was simply a weapon waiting to be repurposed. The Bloodthirster lay on the cracked continental stone and made a sound like a cathedral falling, and the demon flocks above went absolutely silent. The other Bloodthirsters did not advance. They stood in their circle around the fragment's edge, axes held at rest, furnace eyes fixed on the armored figure standing over their fallen hierarchy chief, and in the specific psychic pressure of their collective attention, there was something new. Something that didn't belong in the emotional vocabulary of beings bred entirely for divine slaughter. Uncertainty. Uthorix, from his position behind a large piece of shattered continental rock that he had identified early in the engagement as the most defensible point within running distance, allowed himself a carefully controlled exhale. His scrying instruments were registering something extraordinary. The warp fabric around the fragment was changing. Not in the way it changed when a demon exerted influence, pushing and reshaping reality with divine will. It was changing the way it changed when reality pushed back. The Doomslayer's presence, his soul, his history, the dense and incompressible weight of what he was creating a localized counterpressure in the Immaterium, a dent in the warp, pressing inward. In 6,000 years, Uthorix had never seen anything dent the warp from the inside. He emerged from behind his rock with the careful movements of a man who had survived long enough to know that the aftermath of impossible violence was frequently more dangerous than the violence itself. The Bloodthirsters were still standing, still watching. The fallen greater demon was already beginning to reconstitute. Demonic essence flowing back into the shattered wing, the brass armor reknitting with the slow, grinding patience of divine material that had been temporarily inconvenienced rather than genuinely ended. "We should move," Uthorix said. "The ritual components I require are in Sakrave's Archive District, a fragment approximately 3 kilometers north-northeast, currently under Tzeentchian territorial claim." He paused. "Tzeentch's forces will have already observed what happened here through their scrying networks. They will be preparing." The Doomslayer looked at the reconstituting bloodthirster. Then he looked north-northeast. Then he looked at Uthorix with the specific quality of attention that communicated, without words, in an entire paragraph of meaning. Something in the register of "you have been consistently accurate about what lies ahead and consistently useless during the actual engagement, and I have noted both of these facts." "I am a sorcerer," Uthorix said, with the dignity of a being who had made peace with his limitations 6 millennia ago, "not a combatant. My value to you is navigational and informational. I am, in the taxonomy of this expedition, the map." A pause. "Maps," the Doomslayer's body language communicated, with remarkable clarity for a being that hadn't spoken a word since arriving in the Eye of Terror, "do not require this much protecting." "Fair," Uthorix conceded. The Archive District fragment was, as Uthorix had predicted, prepared. Tzeentch's approach to military defense was philosophically distinct from Khorne's in every meaningful way. Where Khorne valued direct confrontation, the honest, theologically pure exchange of violence between worthy opponents, Tzeentch valued layers. Every defensive position concealed 3 others. Every apparent weakness was a corridor leading to a prepared killing ground. Every trap was also a test, and every test was also a trap. And the correct response to any given situation was always, from Tzeentch's perspective, the one that the defender had not anticipated, which meant that the correct defensive strategy was to have anticipated everything. The Archive District's outer approach was therefore not defended by warriors. It was defended by a labyrinth, not metaphorically. The Tzeentchian sorcerers responsible for the district's protection had spent 3 decades constructing a physical-psychic hybrid maze across the fragment's approach vectors, a structure that existed simultaneously in real space and in the warp, its geometry shifting on a cycle tied to the local probability currents, its walls capable of rerouting travelers not just spatially but temporally, depositing the lost in moments slightly offset from the present where the exit had already been sealed. It was, by any reasonable assessment, impassable without either a detailed map of its current configuration, which changed every 47 seconds, or a deep working knowledge of Tzeentchian architectural theory. The Doomslayer looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. He hit it at a sprint. The labyrinth attempted to reroute him. The walls shifted. He went through them. The temporal displacement triggered. He felt it as a slight wrongness in his inner ear, a moment where the motion tracker's contacts blinked and reset, and emerged 3 seconds in his own past, which meant he was briefly running alongside a ghost of his own previous position before the timelines reconciled with the grinding reluctance of reality being asked to accommodate something it had no category for. He didn't slow down. Uthorix, following the path the Doomslayer had physically torn through the labyrinth's walls, navigated the maze in approximately 4 minutes, using the structural damage as a guide. It was, he reflected, the least elegant solution to a Tzeentchian defensive maze he had ever witnessed. It was also the only solution he had ever seen actually work. The Archive District's interior was a forest of crystalline data spires, towers of solidified warp memory, each one containing centuries of stolen knowledge encoded in the mineral structure of the crystal itself. Tzeentch's servants collected information the way Nurgles collected disease, compulsively, comprehensively, with a theological conviction that knowledge was not merely power, but substance, the fundamental building material of a properly ordered universe. The ritual components Uthorix needed were in the deepest spire. The deepest spire was guarded by a Lord of Change. Uthorix had been hoping to avoid this particular complication. Lords of Change were Tzeentch's greater demons, avian beings of impossible height and impossible intelligence. Their every feather a scrying lens, their every word a working of fate magic, their presence a constant low-level rewrite of probability in their immediate environment. They were not fighters in the way bloodthirsters were fighters. They were something considerably more dangerous. They were thinkers who happened to also be capable of leveling city blocks. This one was called Zeltharion, the Twice-Knowing, and it had been watching them since they entered the labyrinth. It stood before the deepest spire with its vast wings folded and its staff held loosely at rest. And it regarded the Doomslayer with the calm, eye-focused attention of a being that had already run 17,000 simulations of this encounter and found the results consistently fascinating. "I have seen you in 11 possible futures," it said. Its voice was everywhere simultaneously, not loud, but present, the way the concept of sound was present before any specific sound occurred. "In 9 of them, you attempt to kill me immediately." It tilted its avian head. "In 7 of those 9, you succeed in damaging me significantly." The super shotgun was already up. "I would like," Zeltharion continued, with perfect composure, "to discuss the other 2 futures." The 2 futures Zeltharion wanted to discuss were, predictably, the ones where the Doomslayer didn't immediately attempt to kill it. Uthorix, standing at a careful distance that he had calculated as outside the Lord of Change's casual reach, but close enough to hear the conversation, found himself in the peculiar position of hoping the Doomslayer's patience, demonstrated once, with him, under circumstances considerably less theologically complex, would hold for a second application. Lords of Change did not speak without purpose. Every word Zeltharion uttered was a piece of a larger working, a thread being fed into a tapestry of consequence that the greater demon had been weaving since before most of Paraculum's towers had been built. If it wanted to talk, the talking was the trap, but the talking was also, potentially, the only path through. The Doomslayer's shotgun stayed level. Zeltharion appeared to take this as sufficient permission to continue. "In the futures where you take the components you require and return to your dimension," it said, "2 things occur that do not occur in any other futures I have examined." It began to pace, slowly, with the loose-limbed grace of a creature whose joints operated on principles slightly different from standard avian anatomy. The first, the dimensional scar you leave behind when you depart does not close. It scabs. It becomes a permanent weak point in the warp fabric between your hell and our Immaterium, a point through which, given sufficient motivation and ritual knowledge, traffic could flow in both directions. It paused. Regularly. The shotgun didn't move. The second thing, Zeltharion continued, is considerably more interesting. Your passage through the Eye of Terror, the specific metaphysical signature of a being immune to warp corruption, moving through the deepest regions of the Immaterium, leaves a trail, a resonance, something that persists in the warp fabric the way a ship's wake persists in water, long after the ship has gone. The greater demon's many eyes, each one a different color, each one focused on a slightly different point in space-time, converged on the Doomslayer simultaneously. Other things follow trails. Uthorix went very still. He understood what Zeltharion was describing. He had the context that the Doomslayer lacked, the 10,000 years of warp scholarship that allowed him to extrapolate from trail and other things to their inevitable conclusion. If the Doomslayer's passage left a resonance signature, and if that signature pointed back toward the dimensional intersection that had brought him here, then anything in the Eye of Terror that could read warp trails had a map. A map leading directly to whatever hell dimension the Doomslayer called home. And the Eye of Terror contained entities that had spent 10 millennia looking for exactly this kind of map. The Chaos Gods, Uthorix said quietly, more to himself than to either of the others, would very much like access to a new hell dimension. Among others, Zeltharion agreed, acknowledging Uthorix's presence with the mild surprise of a being that had technically known he was there, but hadn't considered him worth addressing until now. There are older things in the Deep Eye than the Four, things that predate the fall of the Eldar, things that have been patient in the way that only entities with no relationship to linear time can be patient. It folded its wings slightly, a gesture that managed to convey something in the neighborhood of genuine concern without quite committing to it. Your departure, in the futures where it occurs quickly, wakes 3 of them. The shotgun lowered, not all the way, but enough. Zeltharion tilted its head again. I am Tzeentch's servant. I do not offer this information from altruism. I lack the architecture for it. I offer it because the futures in which those ancient things wake are futures in which Tzeentch's own plans are disrupted in ways my master finds unacceptable. A pause. My interests and yours align, temporarily, partially, in the specific and limited sense that both of us would prefer those things remain asleep. What do you want? Uthorix asked, because the Doomslayer wasn't going to ask it and someone needed to. The components you came for, Zeltharion said, gesturing toward the deep spire with one talon. I will provide freely. They are, in the futures I prefer, already in your possession. It looked at the Doomslayer. In exchange, I want you to go somewhere before you leave. There is a place in the Deep Eye, deeper than Sacrave, deeper than the Screaming Vortex, where something has been contained for 11,000 years, It has been trying to get out for most of that time. Your passage near it will—" The greater demon paused, and searching for the right word with the visible effort of a being for whom imprecision was physically uncomfortable. "Discourage it for a while." The Doomslayer stared at Zeltharion for a long moment. Then he looked at Uthorix. Uthorix spread his hands in the gesture of a man who had just been asked to translate between two beings who both spoke entirely in implication and subtext. "It wants you to walk past something's cage," he said. "So, the thing in the cage remembers what it's afraid of." Zeltharion said nothing, which was confirmation. The Doomslayer turned back to the Lord of Change, and the moment stretched. The specific quality of silence that occurs when a decision of genuine consequence is being made by someone who makes all their decisions the same way, which is to say, by following the logic of what needs to be done to its conclusion, regardless of what that conclusion costs. He nodded once. Zeltharion's many eyes blinked in sequence, like lights going out down a corridor. It reached into the deep spire and produced a collection of objects. Crystalline fragments, bound manuscripts, a sealed vial of something that glowed with the specific light of captured warp resonance, and set them on the ground between itself and the Doomslayer, with the careful deliberateness of a being that understood the ritual significance of the exchange it was completing. Uthorix moved forward and collected them with the practiced efficiency of a sorcerer who had spent 6,000 years acquiring things that other people considered dangerous to touch. "One more thing," Zeltharion said. The Doomslayer paused. "Slaanesh has become aware of you." The greater demon's voice carried a new quality, not quite warning, not quite sympathy, but somewhere in the narrow register between them. "She who thirsts has sent her finest to find you, and not to destroy you." It paused. "To experience you." Uthorix closed his eyes briefly. "The Keeper of Secrets leading the warband," Zeltharion continued, "is called Velindra the Exquisite. It has broken Space Marine captains. It has unmade Eldar Farseers. It collects experiences the way I collect knowledge, comprehensively, and without particular concern for the well-being of the source." Another pause. "It will find you within the hour. I mention this not because I expect it to change your behavior, but because forewarned is, in this one specific instance, something other than simply another variable for Tzeentch to manipulate." The Doomslayer accepted this information with the same expression he accepted all information, which was no expression at all. He turned and walked toward the fragment's edge, toward the thermal columns that led deeper into the eye. Uthorix fell into step behind him, components secured, his mind already running the ritual calculations he would need for the dimensional reopening. He had what he came for. The path forward was clear, if not safe. "You know," he said, after they had walked in silence for approximately 2 minutes, "in 6,000 years, I have never once successfully predicted how a day in the Eye of Terror would end." He looked at the armored figure moving through the demon world twilight with the total absence of hesitation that Uthorix had come to recognize as the Doomslayer's baseline state. "You are, I think, the first being I have met here that the eye cannot predict either," The Doomslayer said nothing. "I find that," Uthorix said carefully, "either very reassuring or very terrifying." He genuinely wasn't sure which. Violindra the Exquisite arrived exactly when Zeltharion had predicted, which was the most Zinchian thing about the entire encounter. It descended from the thermal columns between continental fragments on wings of iridescent chitin. 6 of them, each one a different shade of the color that existed at the precise boundary between violet and a frequency of light that human eyes weren't built to process without neurological consequences. It was tall in the way that things designed to be impressive were tall, not the brutal structural enormity of a bloodthirster, but the curated, intentional height of a being that had looked at the concept of physical presence and decided to make it an art form. Its armor, if the word applied to something that covered less than 30% of its body with what appeared to be solidified sensation rather than protective material, I caught the light of Sagrave's exposed core and turned it into something that the optic nerve interpreted as beautiful before the rational mind could intervene and flag the warning. The Keeper of Secrets landed on the fragment between the Doomslayer and the thermal column he'd been heading for, and it smiled with a mouth that had too many expressions happening simultaneously. "I have been looking forward to this," Valindra said. Its voice was engineered, not in the mechanical sense, in the sense that every frequency, every harmonic, every subtle variation in timbre had been calibrated over millennia of practice to produce the maximum possible effect on whatever nervous system it was currently addressing. For humans, it triggered something in the limbic system that bypassed rational processing entirely, going directly to the part of the brain responsible for the most fundamental experiences and lighting it up like a hive city at full power. For Eldar, it resonated with the soul stone frequency and produced a sensation described by survivors, the rare ones, as every emotion they had ever felt occurring simultaneously. The Doomslayer's Praetor Suit registered an anomalous audio frequency input and filtered it. Valindra blinked. It was a small thing, the blink, but Uthorix, watching from his position behind the Doomslayer's left shoulder, caught it. In 6,000 years of studying chaos entities, he had cataloged every variety of Slaaneshi expression, and the one that had just crossed Valindra's face belonged to a category he had only observed twice before. It was the expression of a being whose primary weapon had been deployed and had produced no result, and who was, for the first time in a very long time, uncertain about what came next. "Interesting," Valindra said. It tilted its head, a motion that was physically identical to Zeltharion's earlier gesture, but communicated something entirely different, something in the register of aesthetic appreciation rather than intellectual calculation. "You filtered it, not suppressed, filtered, as if my voice was interference rather than signal." It took a step forward. "What does that feel like, I wonder, to move through a universe of sensation and experience none of it?" The shotgun came up. Valindra raised one hand, not in surrender, but in the specific gesture of someone pausing a conversation they're not finished with. "I'm not here to fight you," it said. "Fighting is Khorne's vocabulary. I speak in a different language." Another step. "I want to understand you, what you are, what made you." The many-layered smile widened. Every being has something they want. Every soul has a frequency I can tune to. I have broken things that your Imperium considers unbreakable. I have made Space Marine captains weep for things they didn't know they were missing. It stopped, close enough now that the iridescent wings cast their impossible color across the Praetor Suit's surface. What are you missing? The Praetor Suit's audio filters caught the secondary harmonic embedded in the question. The one that wasn't sound at all but psychic pressure, shaped into the form of a question and directed at the deep architecture of identity. It was, by any technical measurement, the most sophisticated psychological attack Uthorix had ever observed being deployed in real time. Valindra wasn't asking what the Doomslayer wanted. It was asking the warp itself to reach into the space between who the Doomslayer was and who he had been before everything was taken from him, and pull. The warp found the space. It was there. Uthorix could see it in his instruments, a genuine resonance point in the scar tissue of loss so profound and so old that it had calcified into something almost geological. There was a shape to it, a specific absence, the outline of people and a place and a life that had existed before the armor, before the endless war, before the Doomslayer had become the Doomslayer and left behind whatever he had been before that name. The warp pulled. Nothing moved. Not because the loss wasn't real, not because the absence didn't exist, but because the Doomslayer had made a decision about that absence so long ago, in circumstances so far removed from this demon world and this keeper of secrets and this eye of terror, that the decision had become structural. It was not a wall he maintained. It was a foundation he stood on. The grief was there. The rage at what had been taken was there. But they had been running so long that they had become fuel rather than wound, and fuel did not respond to being poked by asking to be fire. Valindra's smile changed quality. It became, for the first time, something genuine, which was, paradoxically, more unsettling than the engineered version. Remarkable, it said softly. You've already burned everything that could be used against you. It studied him with what might, in a being capable of it, have been called respect. There's nothing left to offer and nothing left to threaten. A pause. Do you know how rare that is? In all my existence, I have met perhaps 3 beings who could not be reached by desire or fear. Its wings shifted, catching the core light differently. 2 of them were already dead when I found them. The third, Uthorix asked, despite himself, is standing in front of me, Valindra said. It took a step back, the first backward step, Uthorix realized, that he had ever observed a keeper of secrets take voluntarily in a confrontation. I won't pretend I'm retreating out of wisdom rather than curiosity. I want to see what you do next. The wings spread, catching the thermal. Slaanesh will hear of you. She finds the unreachable fascinating. It will not be a comfortable fascination. It rose on the thermal column, ascending back toward the space between fragments. One piece of information, it called down, and its voice had dropped the engineering, stripped back to something that was almost conversational. The thing Zeltharian wants you to walk past, the thing in the cage in the deep eye. A pause, perfectly timed. It's been calling itself your name. Then it was gone, up into the thermal columns and the daemon flux and the howling space between Sagrave's dying continental fragments, and the sound of its wings faded into the general screaming of the vortex. Uthoric stood very still for a moment. That, he said finally, was either a lie designed to manipulate your course of action, which is the Slaaneshi thing to do, or it was a genuine piece of intelligence offered in exchange for the aesthetic experience of watching your reaction, which is also the Slaaneshi thing to do. He looked at the Doomslayer. I cannot determine which. The Doomslayer looked up at the thermal columns. Then he looked at Uthorix with an expression that communicated with remarkable economy that this changed nothing about the direction he was heading, but that he had noted it, and that noting it had shifted something in the weight of what lay ahead from obstacle to answer. He started walking toward the thermal column. Uthorix followed, because the map had no choice but to go where the expedition went, and because 6,000 years of survival instinct had just been comprehensively overruled by something he was reluctantly identifying as the desire to see what happened next. Below them, Sagrave's exposed core burned with the patient fire of a world that had forgotten how to be anything other than dying. And the demon flocks wheeled in their new patterns. And in the deep eye, in the place below, places where something ancient had been caged for 11,000 years, a presence stirred. It had felt the footsteps above. It had been waiting. The deep eye had no name that translated into any mortal language without causing the translator some form of permanent damage. The Thousand Suns had 7 designations for it across 7 different classification systems, none of which agreed on fundamental details like whether it was a place, a state of being, or a recurring psychic event. The Black Legion called it the Underneath, which was geographically inaccurate but emotionally precise. The Eldar, whose relationship with the Eye of Terror was older and more intimate and more agonizing than any other species alive, called it the place where the warp remembers, which was the most accurate description available and the one that explained, better than any other, why going there was inadvisable. The warp was not, in the conventional sense, alive, but it remembered. It remembered every atrocity committed in its currents, every soul screaming through its non-space. Every daemon spawned from the concentrated residue of mortal emotion, given enough time and psychic pressure to achieve independent existence. It remembered the fall of the Eldar, which had carved it open. It remembered the Horus heresy, which had fed it 10,000 years of perpetual war. It remembered older things, things from before the Imperium, before the Eldar, before any of the species currently arguing over the galaxy had developed the cognitive architecture necessary to make mistakes on a civilizational scale. In the deepest part of this memory, something had been caged. The cage was not physical. Physical cages were for physical things, and what lived in the deep eye had a physical form only in the sense that a storm has a physical form. Technically accurate, practically irrelevant. The cage was metaphysical, a collaborative working maintained by all 4 chaos gods simultaneously, which was the single most remarkable thing about it, given that the four chaos gods agreed on nothing except the necessity of this specific containment. Whatever was caged had been deemed dangerous enough that entities who had spent 10,000 years trying to destroy each other had set that project aside long enough to build a prison together. The Doomslayer descended into it on a thermal column that grew colder as it went deeper, which was wrong in ways that the Praetor Suit's environmental sensors flagged with increasing urgency. Heat didn't decrease toward the exposed core of a dying world, but the deep eye wasn't responding to the laws of thermodynamics. It was responding to the presence of what was caged, which had been cold for 11,000 years in the way that the space between stars is cold. Not the cold of absence, but the cold of something so vast that warmth couldn't find purchase on its surface. But Utharic stopped at the thermal column's lower limit, the point where his instruments began producing readings that his 6,000 years of warp scholarship told him were either categorically impossible or personally fatal, and watched the Doomslayer continue downward alone. "I'll be here," he said, to the armored back descending into the cold dark. "Doing the ritual calculations, not following you into that." A pause. "Specifically not following you into that." The Doomslayer descended. The cage resolved around him gradually, the way eyes adjust to darkness. Not a sudden revelation, but a slow accumulation of detail that assembled itself into comprehension only after the full picture was present. The walls of the cage were made of compressed warp memory, events so traumatic and so enormous that they had solidified into something with structural integrity, layered over centuries into barriers that even divine will had difficulty penetrating. Battles, extinctions, the specific psychic residue of civilization's ending. All of it pressed into service as prison architecture. At the center of the cage, something waited. It was not a demon in any taxonomy Utharic's scholarship covered. It predated the chaos gods, predated the concepts that had eventually crystallized into the chaos gods, the raw emotional substrates of rage and desire and despair and decay that had existed in the warp since the first sentient species in the galaxy had looked at the universe and felt something about it. Those substrates had eventually coalesced into the four. But before the coalescing, in the early formless period when the warp was simply the psychic shadow of a galaxy learning to think, some of those substrates had tried a different path. Not coalescing into singular divine identities, concentrating, becoming dense rather than vast, small rather than infinite, a point rather than a field. Taking everything that the young warp had absorbed from 10 million years of mortal suffering and pressing it into a singularity of pure, undirected, purposeless violence. Violence without theology, without hierarchy, without the organizational structures that the four had built around their appetites to give them shape and direction, and the ability to interact with the mortal universe. The thing in the cage was what violence looked like before it had learned to want anything. It looked at the Doomslayer. He looked back at it. The cold intensified, not as threat, but as recognition, the temperature drop of two things at absolute zero, meeting and confirming each other's existence. The Doomslayer's motion tracker filled with static. His environmental sensors stopped producing coherent readings. The Praetor Suit systems, which had been running on improvised adaptation since the moment he'd arrived in the Eye of Terror, went briefly, entirely silent. In the silence, something communicated. Not in language. Language was too recent an invention, too dependent on the cognitive architecture of species that hadn't existed when this thing had been new. It communicated in the older medium, in the direct transfer of experience, the way a fire communicates heat, the way a storm communicates pressure. It pushed something at the Doomslayer that resolved, in the parts of his mind that processed meaning, into the shape of a question. What are you? The Doomslayer's answer was not verbal either. He let the thing read him, opened the architecture of what he was to the same direct experiential communication, and let it see. The centuries, the war, the hell dimensions burning behind him like a trail of lit fuses. The specific texture of what it felt like to be the thing that hunted the things that hunted everything else. The loss that had been converted to fuel. The purpose that had been burned so long it was no longer separate from the person doing the burning. The thing in the cage was silent for a long time. Then it pushed something back that resolved into neither a question nor a statement, but something older than both. The specific experiential content of recognition between two things that shared a fundamental nature, separated by context and choice. It was not friendly. It was not hostile. It was the acknowledgement of a mirror that showed not your face, but your category, the class of being you belonged to, the metaphysical genus. You are what I became. It communicated, if becoming had been chosen rather than forced. The Doomslayer absorbed this. You are what I am, it continued, with direction, a pause in the non-language. Direction is a cage, too. The Doomslayer stood in the deep eye and considered this from something that, on a being with a less compressed emotional architecture, might have been called a moment of genuine reflection. The thing in the cage was not wrong in the technical sense. Purpose was direction, and direction was constraint, and constraint was a kind of prison. He knew this. He had known it for longer than most civilizations had existed. The difference between himself and the thing before him was not the capacity for violence. It was the choice of where to aim it. He reached out, not physically, and pressed the weight of that choice into the cage's walls. Not as weapon, as demonstration. The cage, built from collaborative divine working and 11,000 years of compressed warp memory, did not crack, but the thing inside it went still. The specific stillness of something that has been shown a possibility it had not previously modeled, and is now processing the implications. Its attention, which had been the cold, steady pressure of a singularity examining everything in reach, drew inward. The temperature began to rise. The Doomslayer ascended the thermal column. Uthorix was waiting, at the ritual components arranged before him in the precise geometric configuration required for dimensional reopening, his instruments running the final calculations on the resonance signature the Doomslayer had left in the warp fabric since his arrival. "Did it work?" he asked. The Doomslayer stopped beside him and looked at the arranged components. Then he looked at the configuration, and something in his posture shifted. The specific micro-adjustment of a being that has just recognized a detail that matters and is deciding how much weight to give it. "The ritual will work," Uthorix said, following the line of the Doomslayer's attention. "The dimensional scar is reopenable. You can go home." A pause. "There is, however, the matter Zeltharion raised. The trail you'll leave. The things that will follow it." The Doomslayer looked at him. "I have," Uthorix said carefully, "a modification to propose." Uthorix's modification was elegant, which was the most Thousand Sons thing about it. The problem, as Zeltharion had framed it, was the trail. The resonance signature, the Doomslayer's passage through the Eye of Terror, had burned into the warp fabric, a metaphysical wake pointing directly back toward the dimensional intersection that had brought him here, and by extension, toward whatever hell dimension lay on the other side of it. The solution Uthorix had spent the descent calculating was not to erase the trail, which was impossible. The warp remembered, and what the warp remembered it kept, but to redirect it. The ritual components from Zeltharion's archive were not, as the Doomslayer might reasonably have assumed, components for a standard dimensional reopening. Standard dimensional reopening required anchoring materials, physical objects with strong resonance ties to the target dimension, used to give the ritual something to pull toward, the way a compass needed a magnetic pole to point at. These components were different. They were resonance scramblers, objects whose metaphysical signatures were so complex and so internally contradictory that any trail connected to them would lead not to a specific location, but to a probability cloud, a smear of potential destinations spread across hundreds of dimensional addresses simultaneously. Connect the Doomslayer's resonance trail to these components before the dimensional reopening. The trail would still exist. The things in the deep eye that could read warp trails would still find it. But instead of a road with a clear destination, they would find a map with 10,000 false addresses and no legend. It will not stop determined entities from eventually triangulating the correct dimensional address, Uthorix said, laying out the logic with the precision of a sorcerer who had spent 6,000 years in an environment where imprecision was fatal. But it will slow them considerably, and it means that what follows your trail will follow it into the probability cloud, rather than directly through the reopened scar. He looked up from the component arrangement. They will spend a very long time looking in the wrong dimensions. The Doomslayer studied the arrangement. There was a problem with it, and Uthorix could see the moment the Doomslayer identified it, because the angle of his attention shifted in the specific way it shifted when he was tracking a threat rather than evaluating a plan. The resonance scrambling required connecting his metaphysical signature to the components, which required a period, brief but real, of direct warp exposure. Not the passive exposure of moving through the eye in a sealed suit with argent energy disrupting the worst of the psychic pressure, active exposure, the kind that required the Praetor Suit's defenses to stand down for the duration of the connection. 20 seconds, Uthorix said, possibly 30. The warp will have direct access to your soul for that duration. He met the visor's flat green gaze. I will not pretend that is not significant. I will tell you that in my professional assessment, your soul's architecture is the single most defensible metaphysical structure I have encountered in 6,000 years of warp scholarship. Whatever the warp finds in those 20 seconds, it will not find purchase. A pause. But you should know what you are agreeing to. The Doomslayer looked at the components. Then he looked at the thermal columns descending toward the deep eye, and Uthorix understood he was thinking about the thing in the cage, about what it had said, about trails and direction and the specific quality of prison that purpose built around itself, about what followed trails, about what followed them home. He knelt beside the component arrangement. Uthorix began the ritual. The 20 seconds were the longest of Uthorix's extended life, and he was not the one experiencing them directly. He could read the warp's reaction in his instruments, the surge of attention as every psychic entity in the eye of terror within sensing range felt a defended soul suddenly made briefly accessible, the equivalent of every predator in a dark forest simultaneously scenting blood. The pressure built in waves, each one probing the architecture of what it had found, each one searching for the cracks that Violindra had already confirmed did not exist, each one withdrawing with the frustrated incomprehension of a key that had been cut for a lock that didn't operate on any mechanism it recognized. The rage was there. The warp found it immediately and pushed. The rage was also a wall. The grief was there, deeper, older, calcified. The warp found it too and pulled. The grief was also a foundation. What the warp could not find, in 20 seconds of unrestricted access to the soul of the Doomslayer, was anywhere to begin. Every wound had been converted to structure. Every loss had been metabolized into purpose. The warp was searching for the raw material of corruption, desire unfulfilled, rage without outlet, grief without resolution, and finding instead the products of what happened when those things ran long enough and hot enough to change state entirely. Not healed, not resolved, transmuted. At 17 seconds, something in the deep eye woke fully and pushed upward with the cold singular pressure of the caged thing recognizing the open signature and reaching for it with everything it had. At 19 seconds, the scrambling connected. At 22 seconds, Uthorix sealed the ritual. The connection closed. The Doomslayer stood up. His suit systems came back online in sequence, in argent energy reasserting itself through the weapon couplings with the returning warmth of a fire that had been briefly banked and was now burning hotter for the interruption. The BFG's charge cycle stabilized. The plasma rifle's energy feed climbed back to full efficiency. Whatever the brief warp exposure had done to the suit's argent energy substrate, it had apparently done it in the way that stress does something to metal, not weakening it, but clarifying it, burning off the inconsistencies that the eye's interference had introduced and leaving the underlying structure more coherent than before. Uthorix checked his instruments. The resonance trail was scrambled. The probability cloud was anchored. The dimensional scar's location in the warp fabric was visible to his sensors. A thin place in the membrane between the Immaterium and whatever lay on the other side, close enough to reach, requiring only the final reopening ritual to widen into a traversable aperture. he began the final working. And that was when the warband arrived. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, which indicated planning rather than opportunism. Someone had been tracking them since Sacrave and had chosen this moment when the sorcerer was committed to a ritual and the armored figure's weapon systems had just come back online from a deliberate stand-down as the optimal window. The 23 Chaos Space Marines in the fractured livery of a warband that had long since stopped identifying with any patron god. Their armor, a patchwork of stripped iconography, chaos stars scratched out, god-specific markings painted over with the flat gray of deliberate apostasy. The renegades Uthorix had mentioned in the outline of his plan. The warband broken from their patron gods, surviving in the Eye's contested territories by refusing to be claimed by any of the 4 and being too dangerous for the 4's servants to eliminate cheaply. Their leader was a figure in Terminator armor, whose size suggested gene seed of Astartes' origin, pushed to its absolute limit, carrying a power fist on the left arm and a bolter on the right that had been modified so extensively it barely qualified as the same weapon class. The helmet was off. The face beneath it was the face of someone who had been handsome once, before the Eye had spent several decades applying its particular aesthetic opinions to his physiology. Not the grotesque mutation of chaos corruption, but the subtler damage of a man who had survived things that left marks, whose eyes had the specific quality of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything and was waiting with genuine patience for something worthy of his attention. He held up the power fist in the universal gesture of halt. His warriors stopped. "We tracked you from the Archive District," he said. His voice was Astartes, the specific resonant timbre of gene-enhanced vocal architecture, carrying easily across the demon world wind. "We watched you put down a bloodthirster. We watched you walk out of Zeltharion's maze through the walls. We watched Valindra leave voluntarily." He paused. "We watched you go down into the cage." He looked at the Doomslayer with the direct, assessing gaze of a soldier who had spent centuries learning to evaluate threats and was currently recalibrating his entire threat assessment framework in real time. "We're not here to fight you," he said. "We tried that calculation. It doesn't end well for us." A pause. "We're here because anything that makes the Eye of Terror afraid of it is something we want to understand. And possibly," he added, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been building to this sentence for a long time, "something we want to help." Uthorix looked up from his ritual work. The dimensional aperture was 3 minutes from completion. 3 minutes in which anything could happen, in which the warband before them could decide that the calculation had changed, in which the things in the deep eye that had felt the resonance scrambling could send something upward to investigate, in which the Eye of Terror could simply, as it routinely did, produce a new complication from a direction no one had been watching. The Doomslayer looked at the Terminator armored figure. Then he looked at the 22 warriors behind him, at their stripped armor and their scratched out iconography and the specific exhaustion of beings who had spent decades refusing to be owned by anything and surviving the consequences of that refusal in one of the most hostile environments in the galaxy. He looked back at their leader, the power fist lowered. the Doomslayer turned back to Uthorix and the ritual working, and positioned himself between the warband and the sorcerer with the calm, absolute certainty of a being that had made a decision and was now simply implementing it. Watching the perimeter, weapons ready, covering the 3 minutes that the ritual needed, while the man doing the ritual finished his work. The warband's leader watched this for a moment. Then he turned to his warriors and began deploying them in a defensive perimeter around the ritual site, covering the angles the Doomslayer wasn't watching, falling into the professional competence of soldiers who had been waiting a very long time for something worth defending. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, the dimensional aperture opened. The aperture was not beautiful. Beauty was not a category that dimensional mechanics cared about, and the specific violence required to reopen a scar in the warp fabric between the Immaterium and an adjacent hell dimension produced something that looked less like a doorway and more like reality losing an argument with itself. The edges of the aperture were ragged, burning with the cold blue-white of exposed dimensional membrane, and through it came a pressure, not wind, not sound, but the specific metaphysical pressure of a dimension that was fundamentally different from the one currently being stood and pressing against the barrier between them, like a hand against glass. The air around the aperture tasted of ozone and something older, something that the Praetor Suit's systems flagged not as a chemical compound, but as a contextual signature, the specific atmospheric fingerprint of a hell dimension that had been hunted so thoroughly and for so long that the very air remembered the hunter. Uthorix completed the final sealing gesture and stepped back from the working, his binding script smoking gently from the exertion. The aperture would hold for approximately 4 minutes before the warp fabric's natural tension pulled it closed again. It was, by the standards of warp sorcery, a remarkably clean working. The scrambled resonance trail had anchored correctly. The probability cloud was fully deployed, and the dimensional address encoded in the scar was accessible without being broadcast. Whatever followed the trail from the deep eye would follow it into the cloud and spend a very long time finding nothing. The warband held the perimeter. Nothing had come up from below. The caged thing had gone still again after the scrambling sealed, had gone still in the specific way it had gone still after the Doomslayer demonstration in the cage. The stillness of something processing a new variable rather than the stillness of something that had given up. Uthorix noted this in the part of his mind that cataloged things requiring future attention, and filed it under unresolved, potentially significant revisit when not standing next to an open dimensional aperture in the middle of the Eye of Terror. The warband's leader, who had given his name during the perimeter deployment as Valdric Sorn, formerly of the Iron Warriors, currently of no one and nothing, and preferring it that way, stood beside Uthorix and looked at the aperture with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things and was adding this one to the list without visible distress. "He's going back," Sorn said, not a question. "That was always the destination," Uthorix confirmed. "And the trail is scrambled. Whatever followed him here follows it into the probability cloud. For a time, nothing in the eye is stopped permanently, only delayed. Soren was quiet for a moment, watching the armored figure standing at the aperture's edge, not hesitating, not looking back, simply pausing in the way that a thing at the end of a long journey pauses before the last step, not from doubt, but from the specific moment of transition between one state and another. "He didn't speak," Soren said. "Not once, the whole time." "No," Uthorix agreed, "but he covered your ritual without being asked." "Yes." Soren turned this over with the deliberateness of a man who had spent decades in the Eye, learning to read the things that mattered through the noise of things that didn't. "What is he?" Uthorix considered the question with the genuine attention it deserved, which was more attention than most questions received from him, and arrived at an answer that he suspected would occupy his scholarship for whatever centuries remained to him. "He is what happens," he said finally, "when something decides that the only acceptable response to a universe full of things that should not exist is to become the thing that ends them. Completely. Without compromise. Without the corruption that compromise enables." He looked at the aperture. Every demon in the Eye of Terror fears two things. The first is the Emperor's light, the divine opposition, the faith weapon, the thing that burns them because they are antithetical to it. A pause. The second is older, more primal. It is the fear of being hunted by something that will not stop, that cannot be bargained with or corrupted or broken. That exists for no purpose except their ending. He watched the armored figure at the aperture's edge. The Emperor's light burns them, and this one hunts them. And in the deep architecture of what demons are, beings made of fear and hunger and the prey instincts of the mortal souls they're built from, being hunted is older and more terrible than being burned. Soren absorbed this. At the aperture's edge, the Doomslayer turned. It was not a farewell. The body language contained no sentiment in any direction. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not the specific closing beat of a narrative that wanted to end with meaning. It was simply the movement of a being that had completed a task and was reorienting toward the next one, turning back one final time to confirm that the perimeter was holding, that the sorcerer was clear, that the working was intact. His visor found Soren, held there for 3 seconds. Then it found Uthorix, held there for 5. In the 5 seconds of that attention, Uthorix received no communication, no gesture, no nod, no humanizing farewell from a being that had never been interested in humanizing itself for anyone's comfort. What he received instead was the specific quality of being seen by something that saw very clearly and assessed very accurately, and had assessed him as having performed his function adequately, which was the highest register of acknowledgement available from a being that did not traffic in sentiment. Uthorix, who had survived 6,000 years in the Eye of Terror by being useful, and found that he was, unexpectedly and somewhat inconveniently, moved. He straightened his binding script and inclined his head, the formal gesture of a thousand-sun scholar acknowledging a peer, which was not technically accurate, but was the closest category available. The Doomslayer stepped through the aperture. The dimensional membrane closed behind him like a wound sealing, the ragged edges pulling together. the cold blue-white light guttering out, the pressure from the other side releasing in a final exhalation that stirred the demon world dust in a perfect circle around the point of closure. The warp fabric knit itself back over the scar with the slow reluctance of something that had been forced open against its nature, leaving behind only the faint trace of a resonant signature that led nowhere specific and everywhere simultaneously. Sagrave's winds filled the silence. Sorn looked at the closed scar for a long moment. Then he looked at his warband, 22 Chaos Space Marines who had spent decades surviving the Eye by refusing to be owned by it, standing in a defensive perimeter around a ritual site that no longer needed defending. Weapons at rest, expressions carrying the specific quality of soldiers who had just participated in something they didn't fully understand and were still deciding how they felt about it. "Well," Sorn said. No one added anything to this. Yxuthrix began collecting the spent ritual components, cataloging the workings residue with the professional efficiency of a sorcerer for whom the period immediately following a significant ritual was a data collection opportunity regardless of context. His instruments were running continuously, mapping the changes the Doomslayer's passage had made to the local warp fabric, the dent that pressed inward, the resonance echoes, the specific metaphysical reordering of a region that had been, for 11,000 years, one of the most stable concentrations of chaos power in the galaxy. It was not stable anymore, not in the way a structure is unstable when it has been damaged, in the way a system is unstable when a new variable has been introduced that it doesn't have a category for. The Eye of Terror's theology, the accumulated weight of 10 millennia of demonic certainty that this was their space, their darkness, their unchallenged dominion, had developed a crack, not a physical crack, a conceptual one. The demons of the Eye had spent 10,000 years being afraid of the Emperor's light from outside. They had never had reason to be afraid of something inside. Something had been inside. Something had put down a bloodthirster and walked out of a Tzeentchian maze and turned away a keeper of secrets and descended into the cage of the oldest thing in the warp and come back up. And then it had left. And the leaving was almost worse than the staying, because the leaving meant it could come back, and the possibility of return was the specific kind of fear that didn't resolve, that lived in the permanent conditional tense, that changed the texture of every moment afterward by making it a moment in which the return had not yet happened, rather than a moment of genuine safety. Uthoric sealed his instrument case and stood. "The warband," Sorn said, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of a question being asked sideways, "is going to need somewhere to be, now that this is done." Uthorix looked at him, at the 22 warriors behind him, at the scratched-out iconography and the gray-painted apostasy and the exhausted competence of people who had been surviving without a purpose for long enough that participating in something purposeful had reminded them what the difference felt like. "I have," Uthorix said slowly, "approximately 300 years of research on the dimensional intersection mechanics that brought our visitor here. Research that would benefit considerably from field assets capable of operating in contested warp territory. He paused. And I have, as of approximately 4 hours ago, a very strong professional interest in ensuring that whatever eventually follows that resonance trail out of the probability cloud does not find its way to wherever that aperture led. Soren looked at the closed scar. You want to guard the door? He said. I want to understand it, Uthorix said. The guarding is a secondary function that happens to require people who can survive the eye. He picked up his staff. I am, as I believe I mentioned, a map. Maps require expeditions. Soren was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to his warband. He didn't give an order. He looked at them the way a leader looks at soldiers when the question is genuinely open and the answer genuinely matters, and the soldiers looked back at him the way soldiers look at a leader when they have already decided and are waiting for him to say it out loud so the deciding becomes real. He looked back at Uthorix. Where do we start? He said. Uthorix allowed himself the specific small satisfaction of a scholar who had just acquired exactly the field assets his research required, under circumstances that absolutely no one, including Sinch, had fully predicted, which was an achievement he intended to mention to the Lord of Change if their paths crossed again. With the deep eye, he said, and what's still in it, he began walking. Whatever that thing in the cage does next, I want to be the one who documents it. Behind them, by Sagrave's winds moved through the empty ritual site, and the daemon flocks above shifted their patterns one final time, no longer circling the fragment with the magnetic attention of things oriented toward a singularity, but dispersing, spreading back into the thermal columns and the spaces between continental fragments with the loose, directionless movement of things that had briefly organized themselves around a center of gravity and were now recalibrating to its absence. The Eye of Terror continued. It always continued. But in its deep architecture, in the metaphysical substrate where its theology lived, something had changed its category, moved from absolute to conditional, from unchallenged to having been challenged once. It was a small change, measured against 10,000 years of accumulated certainty. It was also, in the way that all genuine changes are small before they are large, the only kind of change that mattered. The demons of the eye did not discuss it, but they remembered it. And in the warp, memory was everything. The Doomslayer left no marker in the Eye of Terror, no monument, no body count recorded in Imperial archives, no inquisitorial report with his designation at the top, because no inquisitor had been present, and even if one had, the categories available to them would not have accommodated what they were describing. What he left instead was a change in the air. Uthorix spent the following decades documenting it with the meticulous care of a scholar who understood that he had witnessed something that would not happen again in his lifetime, and possibly not in the lifetime of the galaxy's current iteration. The demonic incursion rates from the deep eye declined by measurable percentages. The caged thing attempted no further breaches for 60 years. The bloodthirster cohort that had assembled on Sackgrave dispersed without resolution. No champion had claimed them. No skulls had been offered. And the theological incompleteness of the encounter sat in Khorne's hierarchy like a splinter that couldn't be removed. Velindra was not seen again. Zeltharian's scrying lenses, in every recorded working performed in the years following, returned one consistent anomaly. A blind spot, a place in every calculated future where prediction failed and probability refused to resolve, shaped exactly like an armored figure in a Praetor Suit. Sorn's warband guarded the dimensional scar for 30 years before the first thing crawled out of the probability cloud. It was not what they expected. It was considerably worse. They handled it. Somewhere beyond the closed aperture, in a hell dimension that had been burning for longer than the Immaterium had existed, something moved through the dark with absolute purpose and no hesitation. If the brief cold of the warp's deepest place had left any mark on it, the mark was invisible. The hunt continued. It always continued. In the eye of terror, they had learned a new word. They whispered it in the dark between demon worlds, in the thermal columns above Sagrave's dying core, in the deep cage where something ancient and purposeless sat in the cold and thought about direction. The word was dread, and they had learned it from something that would never know it itself. The Emperor protects. More stories await.